Let me start by telling you a story. So one day, about 9 years ago, I'm browsing through YouTube when I stumble upon a tutorial for cutting your own bangs. And on this particular afternoon, 7-year-old me was feeling especially impulsive. So I decided to run upstairs, grab a chunk of hair, grab a pair of scissors, and just go. To say it looked like I had a mustache on my forehead would be an understatement. Now, it finally dawned on me that my mom would not be thrilled with my very permanent decision. She had raised me to be an honest and responsible child, so naturally, I decided to swipe the hair chunks off the counter, cross my fingers, and just pray to God and hope she doesn't notice. And as you can probably expect, she did notice after I nonchalantly marched downstairs bearing a passing resemblance to the broom she was using to clean up. But it did teach me a lesson. Ignoring a problem will not make it go away. Now, this lesson extends far past the scope of my horrible decision, because when I simply pretended that it didn't happen, I was engaging in something many of us do every single day without even realizing it. The ignorance is bliss mentality. We often ignore certain problems or events within our lives because we feel they're insignificant in comparison to the other things we have to worry about. However, this becomes dangerous when we start to apply this mentality to serious issues in the real world as well. But I worry that by disregarding these real-world problems, we also lose the ability to understand their magnitude, which leads to ignorance in the long run. And that is my concern. I fear that in a world full of horror and headlines, by turning a blind eye to potentially devastating events, we ensure they will continue to harm us in the long run. As Margaret Heffernan explains in her book, Why We Ignore the Obvious at Our Peril, we choose to remain unseeing in situations where we could know, and we should know. But we choose not to know, because it makes us feel better to not know. However, in a world today where voiced issues such as racial discrimination, gun violence, and sexism demand to be heard, we simply can't afford not to listen. So today, let's first take a closer look at where this mentality comes from and why we are conditioned in our own bubbles. Second, analyze some examples of how we apply this mentality to our personal lives and on a global level as well, before finally coming up with some steps we can take to create a change, one issue at a time. Now, just as I had swiped those chunks of hair off the counter, when we have a problem we want to ignore, we also try to get rid of factors that remind us of it. Out of sight, out of mind. Right? Wrong. A psychological expert, April Masani, explains, it's like having a cavity and chewing on the other side of your mouth to get rid of the pain. Sure, it may relieve it temporarily, but the cavity, which is getting worse, will only cause you more trouble in the long run. We feel that if we ignore a problem, and I mean really pretend it isn't there, then as far as we're concerned, it never existed to begin with. However, this is further from the truth than anything. A problem left unresolved in this way is like a ticking time bomb. It will only aggravate the longer we don't talk about it. Whether it be the bangs you definitely should not have cut yourself, the test you're procrastinating studying for, or even just hitting the snooze button on the alarm clock when you're already running late for work. I mean, we all do it. But unfortunately, that's not all we ignore. Sometimes, without even realizing it, we begin to apply this mentality to serious issues in the real world as well. Partially because we may not want to accept their presence, or our own inability to address them. For example, do you all remember the Flint, Michigan water crisis from 2014? Well, while most recognize the incident itself, not very many people realize that this crisis is still affecting residents to date. It has been 6 years, and there's still doubt as to whether or not Flint citizens have lead-free water today. In April of 2018, the government stopped providing free bottled water to Flint citizens, claiming that their water quality had been restored. However, citizens are still skeptical. And why shouldn't they be? Because 6 years ago, when this crisis first started, officials repeatedly denied there was ever anything wrong with Flint's water, despite test results clearly indicating that there was. Later, officials continued to manipulate test results, downplay the problem, and lie to residents. How are citizens supposed to trust a system, trust a government that tried to downplay a problem that affected over 100,000 people? Hundreds of families, children, human lives. By trying to ignore the problem, but even worse, being very aware that they are ignoring it, officials have made the situation indefinitely worse, to the point where citizens feel like they can't even trust their own government, when they may have clean water for the first time in years. But the reason that officials were able to ignore Flint was simply because they saw it as old news, washed over by 6 years' worth of new crises, problems, and events to worry about. However, to the citizens themselves, they still saw this issue as very much current. And this phenomena happens way more often than you may expect. It happens every time we turn on the television and are confronted with dozens of articles at once. Now more than ever. It leaves us feeling overwhelmed, which means we no longer internalize these issues. In fact, according to a Pew Research Center poll, 70% of Americans reported feeling worn out or exhausted by the 24-hour news cycle. And many also stated that it leaves them feeling helpless to calls for action. See, what happens is that we as citizens want to respond to every problem and every call, but realistically understand that we just aren't able to. So we don't respond to any. And part of that problem may just be that we don't know how we should be responding. But that doesn't justify idleness. Even simply talking about it, starting a conversation rather than diverting the subject matter, is a step in the right direction. Because out of sight, out of mind has no place here. We all must take action. So, how do we start this action? Because simply waiting for the problem to solve itself will only result in more problems, more frustration, but ultimately, more lives lost. Well, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you today, because this problem isn't so clear-cut and simple that I could just give you one in 10 minutes. But that doesn't mean we can't take steps towards a change, disregarding how little they may be, because we know they go towards progress. One of the biggest reasons we ignore real-world problems are because we feel that our actions don't have a larger impact. And that's the first thing that needs to change, this mentality. We need to understand that just because we can't solve everything doesn't mean we can't solve anything. In fact, just take the example of a group of students from Colorado who, upon realizing that their state's suicide rates were on the rise, started a program called Offline October, which advocates for a decreased and healthier use of social media. With time after advocating and creating campaigns, today over 150 schools across the nation participate in this program. Because that's all it takes. Just one step. And trust me, I know how easy it is to ignore your problems. Because when you have something stressful coming up, such as a big test or maybe an interview, ignoring our problems can help take that pressure off temporarily. But what we often forget is that itself is the problem. It's only temporary. Soon enough, you're going to come face to face with whatever it was you were dreading, simply wishing you had acknowledged it earlier. Avoiding action or consequence is the main reason we ignore our problems. But what we also forget is that it's far better than simply sitting and letting things get worse. So take that action and face that consequence. But always remember it's better than the alternative. Take me, for example. If I had simply told my mom about the bangs earlier, I could have avoided a lot of weird stares and comments the next day at school. But, more seriously, think about how it could have prevented Flint citizens from feeling like they had no clean source of water for over 5 years. Or how many students were benefited by Offline October. Because it shouldn't matter if something is out of sight. Because the only way we can fight willful ignorance is if we always keep it in mind.